recent enforcement actions have really shown that failing to screen upstream vendors can lead to repeated dealings with specially designated nationals through intermediaries, and even when the customer-facing side of the business may look positive. So really that upstream screening of your vendors is so critical.
Hello, welcome to a very special episode of FDA Watch. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. As you know, we're the leading independent, nonpartisan podcast on FDA. This episode is another installment in one of our signature multi-episode series that we produce in collaboration with law firms and other organizations. This is the second in a four-part series we're doing with the law firm Arnall Golden Gregory, very well-known law firm, and has a wide practice in the FDA area. In the first part of the series, we focused on the current state of enforcement by FDA and the Department of Justice. In today's episode, we'll be discussing customs regulation and international trade. And we have just the right people to take us on that journey, so let's meet them now. First guest, Luis Arandia Jr. Luis is a partner and co-chair of international trade at AGG. He helps companies navigate tariffs, customs, export controls, and sanctions, and he represents clients before key regulatory agencies and the courts, and he's well known as a speaker and author on global trade issues. Also joining us today is Allison Raley. She's a partner in AGG's corporate and finance practice. She's chair of the firm's international compliance and risk team. She advises pharmaceutical, life sciences, cosmetics, and other multinational companies on cross-border regulatory compliance and international business matters. So let me start out by asking about two topics that are especially important in this decade: supply chain and tariffs. Let me start with you, Luis. How should pharmaceutical and biologics companies think about and rethink about their global supply chains in light of the new Section 232 tariffs on patented pharmaceutical products? We've been reading for months and months about tariffs, and obviously the pharmaceutical industry is affected. I especially want to focus on APIs, starting materials, and finished dosage forms that are sourced from many jurisdictions. So, Luis, let me start with you, and then Allison can weigh in.
Thank you so much for the time and opportunity to speak to all y'all today, Wayne. Let me first by maybe set the landscape of what are the different tariff actions we're talking about, because sometimes the legalese of Section 232 and others may be a little confusing, especially in light of the Supreme Court's decision early this year on a specific type of tariff. So what we're talking about now is the so-called Section 232 national security tariff. So the administration started an investigation on imported pharmaceutical goods, basically determining that imports of these types of items threaten the U.S. national security. The U.S. Supreme Court invalidated a certain type of tariff action called IEEPA. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about Section 232, which is kind of more resilient in the courts these days. But it's different than an IEEPA. It's a very technical action due to come online here at the end of the month, July 31st. And some of the things that is interesting about this action is it weaves both in the FDA language, FDA regulatory nomenclature, as well as the traditional customs and international trade framework. So basically, in short, this tariff action will cover certain types of patented pharmaceutical articles that are subject to a valid, unexpired U.S. patent listed on the FDA Orange or Purple Book, and certain APIs and key starting ingredients. Now, the way to determine whether or not an article is subject to this action, you had to check the specific annex of this proclamation, and in conjunction with the specific terms and definitions of this action. So it's a very kind of technical thing. And if you are not aware of this upcoming action, the starting point is to first understand what is this action all about, and are your products could be subject to or potentially exempt from it.
So what it means, but before we go on to Allison, just want to ask you to do a little bit of a deeper dive and maybe simplify what's going on. So there will be tariffs on certain pharmaceutical ingredients, and companies are going to need to be aware of that and track it, and it will obviously affect any pharmaceutical company that is involved in the import of any of these ingredients. Is that what's going on?
Yeah, generally so. And there's some, and Alice can speak to some of the exemptions that are currently available as of today. But generally speaking, if a pharmaceutical article, that be a finished drug or APIs or other types of starting ingredients, could be subject to pretty high tariffs, 100% duty tariffs, pretty soon.
And so, again, let me ask you one more question before we turn to Allison. What does it mean? How consequential is that to companies, to the price of pharmaceuticals down the road? Just give me an interpretation as to what it all means.
Yeah. So basically, let's say you have a dosage of a imported pill that the company is buying for $100, or let's say $1,000 from a foreign supplier. There would now be a $100 duty, additional tariff on that $1,000 product. So it's going to raise the cost of imported merchandise, and probably that price would be passed on to consumers or other types of business consumers. And the way it is designed is subject to certain exemptions. It's going to be pretty tough to absorb.
Allison, let me ask you to weigh in on this.
Yes, thanks, Wayne, and thank you for having us today. We're really excited to speak with you and your listeners. I'll take the flip side, actually, of the Section 232 conversation and actually talk about who's not included in the scope, because that's just as important for companies when they're rethinking their supply chains. We've actually seen several clients, new clients, reach out thinking they were in scope and they're not in scope. So I think it's important to understand who is and who's not. So as Luis mentioned, the new 232 tariffs are deliberately targeted at our patented pharmaceutical products and their associated ingredients. So basically, products that are on patent and listed in FDA's Orange Book or Purple Book, and that meets the proclamation's definition of patented pharmaceutical articles. So by contrast, there's several big buckets of products that are outside the tariff, at least for now. First, it's generic pharmaceuticals, right? Obviously, and biosimilars. And associated ingredients are expressly excluded. So the executive order and related guidance does a really good job of making clear that it's only targeted at the FDA-approved drugs and biologics. So those that are off patent or off exclusivity, including our ANDA generics, which are probably relevant for this listenership, 501(b)(2) products deemed, therapeutically equivalent, biosimilars under 351(k), and authorized generics imported by generic or biosimilar manufacturers. So those are not going to be subject. Additionally, orphans. So there's a very important carve out for orphan drugs and related specialty categories. If all approved indications for a drug are designated, and that designation is really important, if they're designated as orphan under the Orphan Drug Act, those drugs and their associated ingredients are eligible for a zero tariff rate, which is obviously really critical and helpful for those with urgent health need criterias. Similarly, the zero rate treatment is available for nuclear medicines, plasma-derived therapies, and fertility treatments. And there's a few other specific carve-outs that are included in the proclamation. Third, and I think it's probably obvious, but maybe worth calling out, any of the pharmaceuticals that are U.S. in nature, so they're made here, they're U.S. products, are not in scope. So I think it's important when especially our companies and our clients are thinking about how they'll be affected by tariffs. Sometimes understanding who's not affected is equally as helpful in making those really business-facing decisions.
So let me ask both of you. Let me start with you, Allison. What are your pharmaceutical clients doing about it?
Yeah. Well, I think they're taking a multi-tiered approach, which I think is really wise. They're, tackling it from the customs side because that's where we're seeing a lot of that unexpected or now expected risk on the FDA-regulated goods. So first, it's probably the most underrated issue and easiest to solve is looking at your HTS classification and country of origin analysis.
So explain what that is before you go on. Explain what that is.
Sure. So when a product comes into the United States, it has a unique 10-digit classification identifier. It describes what the product is. It helps our Border Patrol properly review the import and as it comes into the country. So it's a very specific coding per product, and it is very how a product is classified has implications on whether it's on the Section 232 annexes or if it falls into another exclusion. So having the correct HTS classification related to your products is very critical. Your country of origin, especially for clients that have very complex supply chains, say there's multiple APIs or multiple other ingredients that go into the end product pharmaceutical, determining your country of origin can be a very complex and sometimes changing depending on your sourcing endeavor. When the product comes across the border, those two things, your HTS classification as well as your country of origin, are two of the very first things that are examined on imports. And it's also often overlooked as a refresh. So what we see commonly is a product that has been developed maybe even 20 years ago by a client. They looked at the HTS code at that time. They've not revisited it since that original iteration of the product. And because there's thousands of codes issued every year or multiple segments a year, their code has most likely changed from that initial classification. Similarly, oftentimes a product's country of origin will be decided based on a product's first import by our clients, not our clients, but by clients. And it's not revisited, even though key API locations have changed, manufacturing's changed. So making sure that you are incorporating yearly even a due diligence refresh of your HTS codes and your country of origin is a really critical way to reduce investigations that may occur based on misclassification or mislabelings in your records of import.
Yeah, Luis, I think you said this that beginning in August, these tariffs are imposed?
July 31st.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And to follow up on Allison's point, I think it's critical that companies in this space basically set up a war room, if they haven't already, to prepare for this action, because it is 100% duty is There's a lot. So to echo what Allison was saying, a war room to confirm your tariff classification of imported goods. Are there any available exemptions that we can maybe utilize that are currently available in the proclamation? Is the country of origin determination solid? Like if customs were to ask us on the country of origin analysis, are we prepared to answer that? And there's other types of different duty mitigation strategies that we've been obviously advising on for the past year and a half during this very fluid international trade policy environment.
Very interesting. Very interesting. A year ago, I guess, we were reading more about tariffs. There's so much other news going on that we tend to read a little bit less about them. But certainly this is an important development for the pharmaceutical industry. Want to shift gears, turn to customs. What are the most common customs and trade compliance issues you see when importing FDA-regulated products such as drugs, biologics, devices, foods? And how can industry executives use legal risk mapping to avoid detentions and refusals and unexpected duty exposure? Allison, why don't you begin, and then Luis?
Of course. And we kind of spoke about it just briefly before, that HTS code and country of origin mapping. But we often see investigations triggered when there's a disconnect between the paper story and the physical product. So a finished dosage form is declared under a formulation, as we talked about, HTS code. But the commercial documents and the FDA product code might suggest a different dosage or route of administration, or a biologic is entered as a finished product of country A, while the same paperwork shows multiple critical processing steps in country B and C. Those type of discrepancies lead customs to ask whether the HTS code's correct, whether the origin determination for a preferential tariff of Section 232 or 301 purposes is accurate, and increasingly, whether there's a forced labor exposure embedded in a particular HTS code or origin combination. So from a risk mapping standpoint, executives should, as Luis mentioned, literally start with a matrix of your HTS code used for each product family, where the origin is claimed, where manufacturing is for the products, fill finish, and packaging, and where those actually occur, and which of those jurisdictions are touched by special regimes. Be that Section 232, as we've talked quite a bit about today, or 301 tariffs, or forced labor import bans, or heightened scrutiny sanctions lists. That's really the first lens that tells you where a small data error could translate into a bigger enforcement event later on. The second, when we're talking about FDA, so that's really pharmaceuticals, not just FDA pharmaceuticals, life sciences as a whole. The second bucket of issues for FDA products is missing or inaccurate FDA-specific data elements in the entry, such as product codes, affirmations of compliance, manufacturer and shipper information, quantities, and also intended use, and that your intended use is actually what the intended use is for your product, which isn't always, we don't always see that lining up all the time. So FDA's own guidance is clear that the entries with incomplete or inaccurate information are flagged for a manual review. And that manual review is where the reason I see a lot of detentions coming from.
Luis, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I think as a top level item, sometimes we talk to importer clients that may not be aware that the real customs liability on these entries falls on the importer record. It doesn't matter if you relied upon a tariff classification supplied by a foreign supplier, or you directed your customs broker to enter a certain way and they didn't, uh, you know, outside your direction. Ultimately, the importer record company is liable for everything that is imported, and that liability really comes into play because they have a duty to exercise what's called reasonable care. So, are they really taking care of their entries? Are they really understanding what they're importing? And to fall on Allison's points about classification and origin, one of the major pillars of customs law is valuation. And valuation is key, actually, in this pharmaceutical and biologic space because uh, basically we see a potential for undervaluation. So, very, very simply, a valuation is what is the price of the goods declared on entry? And are there any missing price adjustments that should have been added to the price declared on entry? So, for example, a big common um, undervaluation issue that we see is royalty payments. Royalty payments to either API manufacturers or whomever that are not included in the price of the finished drug. In terms of medical devices, what if a company pays an outside third party company for the design of a certain device, and that device is then that design is sent to another country for actual production? Well, that price you paid for the design maybe needs to be included in the value of the goods. All that to raise the value and potential duty liability of the imported product.
Very interesting. Time for one more question before we take a break. And I want to revisit tariffs. We talked about Section 232. Are there any other potential tariff actions that companies should be following these days? And we're talking about medical devices, pharmaceuticals, the products that are regulated by FDA. Allison, let me start with you on that.
When we talk about tariffs on medical devices right now, it's helpful to think in layers. Section 232, what we've been talking about, is one layer. The second layer is Section 301s. So the U.S. Trade Representative has now proposed broad additional duties of 10 to 12.5% on imports from dozens of economies, explicitly linked to gaps in forced labor import obligations. Those proposals have been organized by HTS codes, and they absolutely reach into the medical space, which I think is important to note here. Everything from equipment and consumables to plastic components and tubings used in devices. Unless a device fits into a specific exclusion, then it could be subject to a 232 national security tariff. It can still pick up a 10 to 12.5 Section 301 duty on top of its normal MFN rate. And I think that's a key point for our executives. You can have a device that's not directly in scope of Section 232 pharmaceutical actions and may even benefit from a medical device specific exemption under that investigation. But it can still be exposed under our Section 301s if it sits under an HTS code that's targeted because of forced labor concerns or broader trade policy objectives. So the only way to see that clearly is to do the tariff risk mapping, which Luis kind of spoke about earlier, at the HTS code level. For each device category, ask, is this code on any of the 232 annexes? And then is it on any of the 301 forced labor or other tariff lists? If we do so, then we can determine if there's an exclusion, if one's applicable. So without that map, we've seen companies may think they've avoided the headline of 232 risk and yet still face unexpected duty exposure on the same product. And, and those are lower tariff rates, but that still can significantly impact your revenue at those rates.
Luis, final word before the break.
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. So I know we talked a little bit about Section 301. Going back to Section 232, there's an ongoing investigation, again, that it may be scheduled to end sometime this fall into medical devices, PPE, medical consumables, and other medical equipment. And, what Allison said is totally true about risk mapping. So if something may not be subject to a current tariff action as of today, it may be subject to in the future. So just a really brief description of this upcoming investigation that may result in a tariff action. Medical equipment is considered, it's interpreted broadly to include durable equipment, like carriages and wheelchairs, medical beds, medical devices, also broad, pacemakers, insulin pumps, blood glucose monitors, medical apparatus, MRI machines could be at some point, if imported, be subject to different tariff action under Section 232 authority. So I think understanding what's maybe coming down the road and what's happening right now is critical.
Sounds like this is keeping both of you very busy. So
Yes, it is.
We'll take a quick break now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. And we're back. We're talking with Luis Arandia Jr. and Allison Raley, both partners at the law firm Arnall Golden Gregory. We're talking about tariffs. We're talking about customs. We're talking about a real challenge for pharmaceutical, medical devices, and other companies that are regulated by the FDA. You both mentioned forced labor, and I want to focus on that for a minute. There seems to be, based on what I've heard so far, heightened enforcement on forced labor in global supply chains. First, Allison, let me start with you. Define what is meant by forced labor. I mean, I think we can pretty much guess what it is, but what practical steps should companies take to ensure that raw materials, packaging, and assembled products can clear customs without detention under the forced labor laws or similar import bans?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the simplest way of thinking about what is forced labor is there any coercion involved. We definitely still sadly live in a world where that is a factor within our supply chains. So I think the easiest way to think about it is the act of coercion on this labor. So with forced labor enforcement, which we are seeing a lot of, and we're definitely as well, not just tariff experts, but we are becoming quickly forced labor experts as well. But with forced labor enforcement, we've really moved out of a theoretical risk to a very real market access issue for pharmaceuticals, medical devices, and even our cosmetic companies. So customs authorities increasingly treat forced labor the same way they've treated other trade remedies. If they have concerns anywhere in the supply chain, they will detain, and we've seen this, they will detain the shipment first and ask questions later. So the challenge for our industry right now is to design for clearance, both in how they build their supply chain in a responsible, sustainable way, but also in how they prepare to respond when a detention happens. So the first practical step is a disciplined supply chain mapping exercise that goes beyond your tier one suppliers, which is used to be how it was done in the past, really just tier one, and that was sufficient. But now for pharmaceuticals, that means that you need visibility all the way back to your facilities that manufacture your APIs and key starting materials, and then move forward all the way through your suppliers and your contract manufacturers and your packagers and even logistic providers. That is the level of granularity that customs is increasingly working with when they're looking at a forced labor risk. So here, to make that tangible, when we're talking on this podcast, think about an API sourced from a region that has a documented issue with forced labor. So you may have a finished dosage form that meets every FDA quality and safety requirement. But if the API manufacturing network includes a plant in a high-risk area, and you can't show who your workers are, how they're recruited, which is important, how they're paid, then that becomes a customs risk. The detention request is not theoretical. It will ask in very practical terms for our clients to walk us through this finished product all the way back to the reactor where the API was made and show us how your workers along that chain were not coerced. Companies that have already mapped out those chains and identified your high-risk nodes can respond, and companies that aren't or are learning their own supply chain on the fly under these intense time pressures most likely won't be successful.
Luis, I wanted to ask you a general question. We're hearing a lot about the shifts in tariffs and supply chains. A lot of this has happened, at least if I'm concerned, a little bit under the radar. We don't see front page headlines about that. But how are shifting tariff and trade policies changing global supply chains for pharmaceuticals and for biologics and for medical devices?
Yeah, thanks, Wayne. I think the biggest change is we hear it all the time. It's just how do we plan for this? Right? It's shifting so much so quickly, and if we take last year as an example, sometimes we would have tariff actions announced on a Friday at 6 p.m. Eastern, due to be effective Monday morning, 12:01 Eastern a.m. And it's very difficult to plan for that. And planning for increased duties at the border when you've bought something maybe a year ago, I think that's just something that would just need to come to mind, like the continued ongoing fluidity of these trade policies. It's not going to stop. So I think the more you can be resilient as a company and maybe identifying your current suppliers and maybe alternative suppliers, I think the better. And you just can't assume that your space will be exempted.
And is that the new norm?
It's a new norm for the immediate future.
Let me ask the final question. For companies sourcing APIs, biologics, device components, food ingredients globally, how should industry manage sanctions and export control exposure, especially when suppliers or logistics providers may be linked either directly or indirectly to restricted jurisdictions or parties? Luis, let me start with you, and then Allison, last word on that.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about export controls. But before that, I think understanding who are all the parties in the supply chain. So that includes intermediary companies. That includes who are your freight forwarders overseas, transport providers. Understanding the complete chain of who's involved is critical to understanding any potential sanctions and export control risk. With regard to export controls, with the current administration, they really kind of been not as active as the tariff front. That being said, export controls is still a big priority area for the administration and Congress as a whole, especially as it relates to exporting biologics. So certain biologics may be subject to controls, may require a license to export to certain jurisdictions. If you're exporting goods in this space, in the FDA space, don't just assume that nothing would apply to your product. Something may apply that would require a license to export. So doing that type of analysis on the front end is critical, because customs can also seize stuff being exported as well as being imported.
Allison, final word on that.
Yes. So recent enforcement actions have really shown that failing to screen upstream vendors can lead to repeated dealings with specially designated nationals through intermediaries. And even when the customer facing side of the business may look positive. So, really, that upstream screening of your vendors is so critical. Compliance functions themselves are increasingly expected to have frequent risk based screening built into their processes for exactly that reason. And that's what our regulators are really expecting. And this is where I know we've talked about it already today, but that supply chain resiliency really comes in. It's to ensure that your backup suppliers are already pre-cleared from a sanctions and export control standpoint. So obviously, it's not always applicable. I know many of the people listening are FDA folks, obviously, and we all understand the pains of not being able to source multiple backup plans for a very specific API that comes from a very specific area or some of our other elements within our products or devices. But of course, best practices for our critical APIs or biologic starting materials and device components, that means really approving at least 2 suppliers during development or early life cycle stages in different jurisdictions. So don't pick 2 in the same jurisdiction unless it's the US. Try to pick them in different jurisdictions in case one jurisdiction becomes an issue later on. Avoid supply chain clusters in those high risk geographics or geographies. So even if you pick a different jurisdiction, if they're in the same geographical area that tends to be more high risk, that would be deemed a supplier cluster that doesn't necessarily protect you. And then documenting why each supplier and each route is considered acceptable from a sanctions and export control perspective. So you can really quickly pivot if one relationship becomes restricted as an executive team making decisions for your company.
Wow. Well, what you've both done is to open my eyes, and my guess is a lot of our listeners' eyes, to a whole area that we haven't thought about, but that companies clearly are grappling with and need to continue to grapple with, and will affect the supply chain, will affect tariffs, will affect the price of certain products. Very interesting. So let me thank you both, Luis Arandia Jr., Allison Raley. Thank you for joining today. Really, really very interesting. That was a great way to continue this 4-part series that we're doing with your law firm, Arnall Golden Gregory. I also want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Evan Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. And I want to remind all our listeners, if you want to find out more about the podcast, visit our website, fdawatch.net. I know you're going to want to hear parts 3 and 4 of this series. So if you subscribe to the podcast, and that's free and simple to do just by going to fdawatch.net, you will be able to subscribe and you will get a notice in your email when a new episode appears. Our podcast really has grown very well since we started a year and a half ago. And we now have almost 25,000 downloads. And that's because so many people are joining us. I'm not going to say every single week, but most weeks. And we really appreciate it and hope to have great episodes coming up. I know we do. So as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch. This is Wayne Pines.